Good afternoon. Welcome to this Exploring English podcast with me, Mr. Craven, from the NET English Directors team. Now I'm here with some of the Freeborough Academy English team. So I've got Mr. Goodwill.
Hello, good morning.
I've got Miss Femi Dixon.
Hello.
Okay, and they're going to be talking to us about Wilfred Owen's rather excellent poem, Exposure. Okay, so let's start. Mr. Goodwill, is this an interesting or at least a useful poem, do you think?
I think it's such a detailed view of the reality of war, and it presents war in a way that maybe some people don't consider it. Maybe as a modern reader and a modern member of society, we look at war and we understand the psychological damage that it causes. But certainly at the time, I think that was quite almost revolutionary.
Like an alternative perspective.
Absolutely.
Okay. So linking to that, in terms of his intentions, in terms of the time he's writing and that sort of thing. So the poet's Wilfred Owen. Is it important to understand him in his context, do you think, in terms of understanding the actual poem, or do you think it's irrelevant? Ms. Femi, any thoughts?
I think understanding Owen's vital. The fact, one of the reasons I like it so much is that he was actually there.
Yes.
Which I think gives it more relevance and more credence. Other poems where the poet imagines what it might be like to be that character.
Certainly in the mythology, so we things like Ben Etcharge, Ted Lewis wasn't a serving soldier, although I think he was in RAF briefly, wasn't he?
And Emma Gray as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where they
Remains
imagine
where it's the voice, but yes.
And that kind of jars with me a little.
Okay.
Certainly the fact that he was actually
it's authentic.
there. Yeah, it's very authentic. And the fact that it's written with a real purpose. I know all poetry is written with a purpose, but this has a really kind of political, message about it, and it reflects experience both in the trenches and I think his what happened to him mentally as well. So.
Can we look into that a little bit? So he's an actual soldier. Obviously, he joins up. So not right at the start of the war, but not long afterwards. He volunteers, which is important, I think. He joins with a sense of religious duty, doesn't he? You mentioned idea about the aspects of this, and also his reasons for writing. Could you just unpack that a little bit? Either of you want to dive in there?
Well, it was written towards the end of the conflict, and before he wrote this poem, he had been returned home to deal with injuries that he'd suffered in the battlefield and experienced how the conflict was being presented at home and how people were reacting to that. And so certainly parts of the poem where he feels shut out and the doors are closed, I think that's a direct reaction to what he experienced.
That inability to return home.
In terms of people understanding what the soldiers have been through. And also then, after the war, those that did survive, the mental damage that they were carrying with that as well.
In terms of his treatment, because he was sent to Craig Lockhart Hospital, wasn't he? I'm probably pronouncing that wrong.
No, it's right.
Is it right? Yeah, thank you. Which is up in Scotland. And it was both a physical hospital, wasn't it, for physical injuries, but it was also essentially a mental hospital as well at the same time. And he was there with Sigrid Sassoon, who influenced him to start writing and so on. So in terms of why he's writing poetry then, so he's returned home, and is it a political statement, do you think? Is it about expressing himself? Is it therapy?
I think it's both itself, but certainly it's political. I think there's, the idea that, the horrors of war weren't really exposed. Sassoon Owen was a journalist beforehand, was before he joined up. I think he'd done some. And I think perhaps these journalistic kind of tendencies. He wants to report war. We take for granted that we'll have, films and photographs from battlefields and from, war zones. But back then,
it was very limited.
Absolutely. And I think he wanted to expose, the reality of war, and it was seen as, as dangerous. The fact that, because as far as I understand, Sassoon was basically in Craig Lockhart to keep him quiet.
Yes.
And so
there was a deal signed off with the government, essentially, wasn't it?
Yes. So the fact that poetry, can be, dangerous and can be, for the establishment.
That's about the point of view. He used this phrase, didn't he, about his poetry is not about heroes. Was English poetry is not yet fit to speak with them, I think was the phrase he used, wasn't it? And he saw his subject as being war and the pity of war, which I think is kind of interesting. And this idea that the poetry then is yes, a means of self-expression, But it's also trying to record the reality of the war, and not like a comforting way, but just for future generations as well. He was thinking about kind of us reading it as well, absolutely. So in terms of, in simple terms, so we cut through it all. Sometimes students view this poem as simply being about a bunch of soldiers bored in the war, getting killed by the weather. Is that right? Is that wrong? Is that limited? Thoughts?
The poem traces the torture that these soldiers face, and like you've just said, that the presentation of war in a very realistic way, in the fact that actually the enemy, in this case the Germans, are probably at the bottom of their concerns.
Yes. And ironically, I suppose also suffering the same things.
Exactly, yeah.
And so unified together.
Yeah, it's the humanity that unites.
Yes.
And I suppose that links with the issue of the First World War. You have essentially Christian countries in conflict with each other, with one God going to give victory to,
and we do have
the most righteous.
About the, we have German soldiers sort of passing letters to English soldiers to give to their girlfriends back in England because they've been there before the war. You know, they are very polite to each other. They get on quite well when they actually meet up. There's a lovely football match on Christmas Day, isn't there? The start of the war. It's a very odd conflict where neither side particularly wants to fight the other, but they are trying to kill each other.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm not sure it is odd. I'm sure that
we're bringing to politics and here.
I was just going to say, I would suggest that nearly all wars like that, it's governments that want to fight as
people
opposed
on both sides.
Yes, and I think maybe this shows the human reality of war. Yeah. As opposed to like the politicality of war. Yes, and it shows the complete and utter lack of glory. If you think of Charge of the Light Brigade, where these men died, but they died. There's the glory and the honour, and we should remember them forever, and all that. Whereas this, it's
the polar opposite. Isn't
yes,
it?
there's no. There's no glory, there's no honour, there's no heroes. They are just simply dying or being destroyed mentally and spiritually.
Yes.
So it's not just about kind of physical destruction, it's about mental and spiritual destruction as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Owen's almost caught between two. He is a leader of men, yet he is subservient to the generals above, and he is in that conflict between being part of his group, but then also following orders that clearly I don't think he fully agrees with.
And almost unable to speak truth to either. So poetry becomes almost an outlet from that.
I think the fact that he uses our suggests that, he feels very much with his men.
With his men, yeah.
And the fact that he went back, he didn't need to go back after he'd left. Yes, after he was discharged from Craiglockhart, he didn't need to go back. The fact that he chose to go back out of some kind of whatever, suggests that he did feel very strong duty bound or loyalty to his men. Or
because there's a shift, isn't there? Also, in terms of he joins up. I think partially out of religious duty, doesn't he? He is devout. He was a missionary. I think briefly before the war, wasn't he? Doing some missionary work.
Right.
And he joins up with a sense of religious duty. Very rarely features in lots of the war poems. God is almost irrelevant, and yet is present here. But just to unpack this first person point of view thing, which I think is interesting. So we assume the poem is set, don't we, on the Western Front, 1916 to 17. It's the coldest winter in living memory. And it's dramatic. We've got frostbite, we've got famine, the soldiers are starving, they're very, very ill-prepared. And that's the point of view that Owen is recording this from. Now, is this then about the war? Is it about the weather? Is it about both? What's he trying to say about these two things, do you think?
Well,
that's a massive question.
It links to the title of the poem, doesn't it? Exposure. It's the exposure of the soldiers to, but probably, as we've said before, it is the weather that is the greatest threat to them.
Yes.
And then I would probably suggest it is the breakdown of their mental well-being and the loss of hope before the actual enemy becomes an issue within their lives almost, and certainly within the poem.
And it becomes that kind of collective experience which you were saying, wouldn't you, Ms. Fenby? So that yes, he's writing from his own point of view, and we assume based on autobiographical experience. Yet at the same time, it is our brain's ache.
Yeah.
It knives us.
What are we doing here?
Absolutely.
And I suppose that, if you take that further, that doesn't need to be just him and his men. That could refer to, all soldiers, doing on the battlefield. What's the point of all war? It doesn't have to just be him in that small microcosm.
I was going to come to that later, actually. We can always deal with that now. So there's an interpretation I've come from students, which is essentially the poem is saying that war is awful, we hate war, it's a bad thing, we don't want to be here, what a waste of time. Do you agree with it?
I think he knows he has to be there.
Yes.
I think there's that sense of duty that not otherwise can kind fires burn. There is that. So I think he knows. I think there's that dichotomy in that, in the given situation, he knows he has to be. Ultimately, war is futile.
Yes.
So I think there is that.
So it's not that he's there for the war; he's there essentially for God, isn't it? If the love of God seems dying, therefore we're born. They are there because they are fighting for life. In a sense, they are there, even not fighting for life. They are there to represent life, to stand up for life and living, and the whole, and literally in a sense, in the middle of the winter, as well.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. I wonder if that for love of God seems dying. I question whether that is his love of God that is dying.
With a sense, isn't it, that he's experiencing a sort of moment of nihilism here, this kind of futility, and what's the point of anything?
Yes, because he started losing some of his religious faith before he joined the war, because he had thought about taking a religious, going down the road of a religious career, but had lost some of his faith, and I think probably the experiences that he saw on the battlefield, were so horrific.
Yes, accelerated that loss of faith.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
It's obviously, a turning point, in Western society, because, before that point, religion had been absolute key cornerstone of everything.
Yeah.
And I think the experience of that war then, shifted towards a more atheist society that we have today.
The war to end all wars.
Yes.
Until the next one.
And the next one.
So let's turn towards the some more formal aspects of it. So in terms of the style, the form that Owens used, the way he's written it, he's structured the poem. Do they fit what he's trying to describe? Do you think? I mean, what's interesting about the way it's written and the way it's laid out and so on? Mr. Goodwill, any thoughts?
It's his use certainly at the end of stanzas absolutely reinforces this idea that they are trapped within this situation, be it duty bound, and I think that is a really but nothing happens. The questioning of why they're here, the questioning of whether they are going to die, it absolutely shows this dilemma he is in and he is facing.
And also the repetitive style of their lives.
Absolutely.
They get up, they serve, people die, they go to bed, that's it, isn't
the
it?
structure of the paragraph, the structure of the stanza kind of reflects the men's experience. So we've got each stanza starts with something quite emotive, and then it builds up and builds up and builds up with all really, really kind of detailed descriptions. So it's kind of building up the energy in each stanza. And then there's a complete anticlimax.
It's almost from like a specific detail, isn't it? So like a broader point in each stanza, and then but it's
that reflects kind of the men's experience. All day they are waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting, and the adrenaline's building and building, but nothing happens.
Yeah.
And so it kind of reflects their emotional journey, and it's that emotional sort of anticlimax. That's what causes the image.
And it's exploring like a mental landscape, which was your point, wasn't it? About the idea of the book does go somewhere in that sense. It's a mental exploration.
Yeah.
Kind of a mental geography.
Which, like you said, is was quite revolutionary, really, I suppose, at that time.
But I think also in terms of the pace of it and the tone of it, I've come across students before who said that actually he writes it in a deliberately boring fashion. I think it's rather it's rather unsympathetic, but I get what they mean. I mean, in terms of we have these long lines, the 12 to 14 syllables in most of the lines are the longer than you'd expect. English poetry is usually about 8 to 10, isn't it? 10 typically. So he's got these deliberately long lines. We've got lots of en general. I will say, by the way, just in terms of you can hear this in the recording, we have the wind whistling around Freeborough Academy. It's very atmospheric fashion. It's wonderful. Yeah. But yes, we have these very long lines with. Some says you're in the middle of lines, but realistically, lots of enjamel, lots of long sentences, overflowing, and so on. We have these half rhymes at the end of lines. He wants it to feel slow paced, like it's dragging, like it's continuous, I think. And it's trying to the soldiers, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And what about the sounds? Any thoughts about that? Because I have a feel with the sounds aspect at this point.
The opening stanza is littered with sibilants.
Isn't it? And all the way through, I think, actually.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so obviously reflecting the main topic of that first stanza with the use of, or the the dealing with the weather as an enemy and as something that is deadly.
But I mean, on a literal level, he's very careful to make sure that the sibilance is there for the merciless iced east winds. It's the sound of the wind whistling.
Yeah.
It's the sentries who whisper, curious knowers. It's the sound of sentries nearby, isn't it?
But then it's so clever. It's so clever how he yes, he uses that sibilance for the wind, but then you've got the alliteration of the W in the second line, which is much slower, and it like draws it out, like reflecting that weariness and that tiredness.
And also they blur into each other.
Yeah.
So the sibilance kind of goes through all these different things. So does the alliteration as well.
Yeah.
It's almost like all these aspects to each other, so it becomes quite disorientating, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But the idea very much that he wants us to almost like to imagine that we are there as an audience. He's writing for an audience, who may not have been anywhere near the front line. I certainly wasn't. That's just the bell going. We will ignore that. There may be some noise outside the classroom as well. We've got a couple of minutes. But yeah, so the idea of kind of this, this soundscape that he's constructing, insight into what it's like to actually experience life as a soldier on the front line. Yeah. In terms of the structure of it, often poems have this kind of this idea of a volta. Do you think there is a volta in this poem, and where would you pin it down as happening? Because there is a bit of debate about this, isn't there?
If you're going to, I suppose if it's where they start kind of slipping into whatever hypothermic state they may be in, and their ghosts drag home, or so we drowse, so that could be seen as a turning point, because this is where
he leaves the physical into his
into sort of this mental questioning why they're there, and why are they dying, and thinking about home and the idea of the doors being shut on them at home.
And really also this idea of the ghost dragging home. This isn't portrayed in like a negative fashion, is it? It's almost comforting, or a bit of a release, isn't it?
Well, I suppose if you take it in a literal, exposure is the term for hypothermia. Yes. And if you are dying of hypothermia, supposedly, not that I would know, but if you're dying of hypothermia,
you do experience those moments of warmth.
You feel warmth and you feel comfort, which is why people go to sleep and don't wake up.
Yes.
So it could be that they're feeling warmer than they've felt in a very long time.
I mean, and to link that then to the idea of the title as well. So to touch on that, exposure is both the reference, side of experience.
Yeah.
Exposure is also about them being exposed to these conditions by the war, by the military. And also the idea, isn't it, that Owen himself is exposing the reality of the war to the audience.
Another thing that I read about the title was that it's the idea of an exposure of a photograph, which of course for a modern audience, we don't expose. But linking that into Owen's journalistic background, because it is such a vivid, description of the war.
It's a series of snapshots.
Yes, and that idea of him presenting this picture of the reality of war to the reader.
Which was very war photography in that sense, isn't it? Because Duffy was talking about the idea, wasn't she? The war photographer, she sees it as like a picture. She's literally structured it and laid it out so it looks like an image.
Yeah.
So actually Owen almost doing the same thing here. It's quite a neat comparison there, actually, isn't it?
Yeah.
That works. And the ghost dragging home also, this blurring of boundaries and sights and sounds and so on. Also there's this photograph developing. Yeah. That's quite neat. I like that. In terms of images then, so we've got lots and lots of quite vivid images, the graphic idea, the twitching agonies of the wire, the poignant misery of dawn, the melancholy on the east, the empty houses, kind fires, the burying party. Which images do you think are the key ones in the poem? Which ones would you tend to go for if you were writing about this?
In that second stanza, like twitching agonies of men among its brambles.
Yes.
Obviously it's the reality, we can read it as the barbed wire of no man's land, but it's the idea of among the brambles, it's almost as if this violence is natural, it is part of human nature, it's something that we cannot escape.
Or possibly the exact opposite, actually, that nature is somehow pushing against the violence. The violence is something that nature is resenting or resisting. I'm not saying I agree with that myself, but I have come across students who argue the idea that nature is almost like punishing mankind, or responding negatively to mankind's aggression. It's a mirror for mankind, in that sense.
For me, that is the most horrific line or the two lines in the poem.
Because the alive, the still.
Because to me, that absolutely suggests that Owen has heard men twitching in the brambles. That is not something. If you're writing a poem, that is not an
something
idea
that naturally comes to you.
You don't naturally think that. He has heard men screaming in agony, caught up in the barbed wire, which which did happen. And that, to me, that's like a real insight into his sort of experience, and he's like
the mental scarring.
It's like in there, and it's not something like you would expect. You couldn't write that. That's what going back to what we were saying at the beginning. You couldn't write that unless you'd been there. To me,
it's war photographer and remains. the kind of the futility and helplessness. You know, as the man sort of dies in front of him in War Photographer, you know, trying to do the right thing by taking the picture, but not helping as a result. Or remains where he's unable to help because of what's just happened. Absolutely. Ms. Goodall, any others you go for?
When I find it, we've talked about the slowly our ghosts drag home. Glimpsing the sunk fires glows with crusted dark red jewels. I think that's a really interesting image. Obviously, the association of the red and the idea of fires being symbolic of hope, of safety. But then the fact it's
sort of glowing and glazing, doesn't it? It does both those things at once.
But then the idea of a jewel, clearly it's something that is very valuable to them. But ultimately, in this case, with it being sort of like this dream hallucination, it actually they gain no warmth for it, even though it is something that they desperately crave.
I think that stands out. I think one of the key things about it is the idea that, you know, they have the warmth, they dream of home, they imagine home, they imagine this house, they imagine the house being empty, they realise that they're not there, they can't be there, and that's what brings them back, isn't it? The sense of, as you were saying earlier, Ms. Fenby, the idea the doors are closed, they can never return home.
And that line's really interesting as well. So shutters and doors are all closed. On us, the doors are closed. It's almost that second half of that.
It's almost
line.
like a door slamming.
It is,
It's
and
like,
and they turn back to their dying at that point.
But then it's a double meaning, isn't it? In the sense that they feel forgotten because of the lack of reporting, because you know the lack of perhaps impact on you know, people at home, and they feel forgotten. But also the fact that, you know, the idea that they realise, and Owen particularly might realise because of what he saw in Craig Lockhart, how impossible it's going to be for them to return home. You know, the experiences that he saw in Craig Lockhart were absolutely horrific. You know, men had been completely and utterly destroyed physically and mentally. And he realises, therefore, that, you know, even if they go back to their families, you know, they'll never...
They are different people.
They're different people.
And there is almost no understanding at the time, is there, of PTSD?
No.
As an officer, you can have shell shock.
Actually, it was so misunderstood. It was punished, wasn't it?
Well, it was for soldiers, wasn't it? Common soldiers weren't allowed to have PTSD. They weren't allowed, you know, you couldn't have shell shock. You were simply a malingerer, weren't you? And you were shot at the stake. Whereas an officer, you might be sent home to cope and to recover, which is what Craig Lockhart was.
Well, absolutely, because the doctor at Craig Lockhart was one of the first. Was one of the first to actually, you know, do work on this, and absolutely, and take, you know, take it sympathetically and actually study it. So.
Just to kind of link into that, there's a wonderful book about this, just something off topic here. Regeneration.
I've just tried to give it to Mr. Goodwill this morning.
It's a fantastic
He's added
book.
it to his reading list.
Regeneration, really good book. About Sassoon and Owen and their friendship, isn't it? And so on. In terms of the structure of the poem, then, so we have this mental exploration. You know, we have this returning home. Where does the poem land at the end? In terms of the way it finishes. So we go from this idea of they go to return home, they imagine being home. Home reminds them of what they're living for, what they're fighting for, why they are there. They're fighting for life and warmth and almost rather become God, don't they? Life and home and people and nature, and that's it. And then we get this last stanza about the burying party. So why is that the last bit? Where does that bring us? Why do we land at the end with this stanza, do you think?
We're almost back where we started, aren't we? And also because
a night watch, which is where we've been through the full day.
But interestingly, the tense changes here.
Yes.
So he's predicting what will happen. His frost will fasten on this mud. You know, this is what happens every single night. He knows that this is what's going to happen.
And also that sense of being drawn into the ground.
Yes.
The frost makes them one with the ground, almost like they are ready. The burying party just finished the job.
Then that shrivelling and puckering, foreheads crisp, that's so evocative, isn't it? It's so like...
drained away. Yes, absolutely.
It's horrible.
Yes. I think it's also interesting, isn't it? The poem ends with death.
Yes.
The burying party is all about death, isn't it? And there's that lovely, not lovely image, sorry, that's what an awful phrase. There's a very interesting, this positive of half-known faces when their eyes are eyes. And they're half-known, of course, aren't they? Because it's soldiers that they may know, they may not know, because there's a very high turnover in the trenches. You may not get to know people very, very well. But also because death changes the appearance, doesn't it? But this thing about all their eyes are eyes. And the question of whose eyes are we talking about? Isn't it?
And whether it's metaphorical, literal, or both.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yes, because the dead bodies on the battlefield, their eyes will literally freeze. The fluids in their eyes.
Yes.
So their eyes are eyes. But the burying party also, going through these things, they become emotionless. They lose that inner warmth.
They become numb to it because it, like you said, it's a daily occurrence.
Yes. but nothing happens. It's the final line.
Yeah.
Just draw it off. Couple of final questions then. So, where do students trip over with this poem? Is there anything in here that the wind in the background? It's fabulous. Is there anything in here that students fall over, they get wrong, that they make a mistake about, that catches them out? Do you think?
I don't find that they don't talk about the structure of the poem.
Yes.
There's so much to talk about in terms of the structure. It's such an easy poem. You know, if you learn some key points, it's such an easy poem to talk about in terms of structure.
And he's very much put thought into both how it's structured, how it is written. You can't separate off the topic from the way it is written as well. The form very much reflects the function, doesn't it?
Doesn't get stuck at the level of what the weather is doing to the soldiers, and I don't think they really go and explore that, the mental aspect of it, or the sort of the spiritual side of it. So it's, you know, that the poem does take us through that journey from the physical to the mental to the spiritual, and I think students maybe only sometimes get stuck on that first level.
They do, and they miss the fact that the cold and the weather are also a metaphor for the wider conditions of the world. The emotional social coldness, essentially. I agree, definitely, absolutely. Yeah, I think also the view of religion, I think sometimes they get wrong as well. Yeah, the fact that actually, and the fact that this is not a purposeless thing he is doing. Although it's war, you know, he recognises and acknowledges in that penultimate stanza there is a reason for being there, there is a value, which is why they don't loathe being there. Therefore, not loathe being lie out here. Absolutely. Okay. In terms of where you'd go for a comparison, then, so if you could choose one poem for a comparison, what would you choose and why?
It would depend on the question.
Oh, that's a dodge.
Remains being the obvious one.
Yep.
Yeah. War photographer. We've spoken
I like the charge personally. Why remains? Why remains? Go on.
Well, because both try to explore the reality of war.
Yes.
And there's the parallel between like the mental.
The authenticity of the voice as a result as well.
Yes.
This is Rob Tremans, isn't it? For remains. And then,
So so that, you know, there are those comparisons to be made.
It's also interesting, isn't it, that Wolf Owen's giving us the as it happens, whereas Armitage is giving us the aftermath.
Yes.
Isn't it?
Yeah,
it's just slightly different. Which is useful to know.
So we've discussed, haven't we, how essentially it's real presentation of the effects of conflict. We have in War Photographer as well, it deals with the anger of how people out of the war zone react to it and view conflict. And we have that covered in Exposure a little bit. And I think we also have both poems have a tremendous sadness about war.
But you could also contrast the viewpoint as well, in that, of course, War Photographer, you know, being third person and the talking about a war photographer, whereas this is very personal.
Yes.
And he's actually.
But he's also trying to universalise it at the same time, which is quite interesting. And in both cases, trying to actually publish the point of view. Think about, you know, the inner conflict people go through. And so on. I mean, for me, Bayonet Charge, I think it's one that does work as well, because in both of them you have a first-person account of literally being. In one of them, it's an immediate, violent, aggressive thing, isn't it? A struggle for survival. In the other, it's a long-term, grinding, dull thing. And the struggle for survival. And in one of them, you have the sense of, well, I'm fighting for God and all the big ideas. You know, not king and country, but I am fighting for a purpose. As a Bayonet Charge is, oh, flipping heck, I just want to live.
Yes.
Isn't it? I'm paraphrasing that. It's not a quotation. So I think any of those are good choices. Absolutely. So, final question. What would your dream question be for this one? Oh, and do you like this as a poem, I suppose, as an addition to that?
I love it as a
poem. Dream question, and kind of what was your...
Reality of war, reality of conflict would be an absolute gift.
Yes, it
would. But you would almost want Exposure not to be the named poem in that question.
Because I think Exposure goes with so many of the other poems, doesn't it? And it's such a good hub poem.
It's almost, you wouldn't want Exposure, you wouldn't want Remains as a named poem, because I think the imagery and the language use and structure in both is so accessible that you would hope students have that knowledge.
Wouldn't argue with that. Experience of the soldiers or experience of people in conflict, I think, is also going to be a good question. Definitely. Right. Oh, and sorry, yes. And do we like it? Yes.
Absolutely. Yes. Absolutely.
Well, I've been studying this since I was 14, so many moons ago, this was my GCSE question as well. So in
my case, not quite when it was first written, but you know. Right, that's it for this podcast. Huge thanks to the Freeborough English team for taking the time to discuss with us. And as ever, if you have any questions, do please talk to your teachers or to any members of the director team. Thank you for listening.